What is it that makes people fall in love with a fighting game character? Strong and attractive visuals to turn heads, an intriguing personality stemming from a solid story foundation, and arguably most importantly, they should enrich the gameplay experience. Today we're talking about a character from Street Fighter 4 who failed on all of these fronts so hard that he's arguably the most hated character in Street Fighter history. That fighter, of course, was the big-bellied and even bigger-mouthed Rufus, Capcom's off-putting amalgamation of some of the worst American stereotypes. But what exactly about the character made him so unlikable, and does he really deserve the crap reputation he's garnered? Before we raise the roof with this space opera symphony, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel. Rufus's initial design was actually nothing like what we ended up with. Starting out as a thin but muscular bald black man with a furred gi similar to Ryu and Ken's, his original name was King Cobra, and he was meant to be more of an acrobatic counterpart to the traditional Shotos. King Cobra would incorporate breakdancing into Kung Fu for a break Kung Fu style that Capcom figured would resonate heavily with American audiences circa 2008.
They're breakdance fighting!
About halfway through the process of recording the character's lines, however, one team member brought an idea out of left field to make King Cobra obese, which was greenlit, and then sparked a series of alterations that completely transformed him. Then they made him a blonde, long-haired man with a fairly off-putting visual design that was now aimed to, quote, freak people out in a manner similar to Blanca amid the cast of Street Fighter 2. The ultimate result looks something like Chris Farley's Beverly Hills Ninja in Bruce Lee's iconic yellow jumpsuit from The Game of Death. While such a visual certainly did turn heads, you could argue that it just as quickly turned them back away once people realized what they were looking at. Those who didn't turn away would get to experience an even bigger turnoff in Rufus's design, his personality. Rufus is a kung fu enthusiast who, after reading an article about Ken Masters' status as the strongest American fighter, becomes insanely jealous and begins a one-sided rivalry against Ken. No one knows who Rufus is, as he hasn't really done anything worthy of much attention, but he and his girlfriend Candy head out to try to find Ken so that Rufus can fight him in public and receive some recognition. When the two finally do meet, a confused Ken has no idea who his opponent is. The two battle, and it's more than likely that Rufus loses, though we never technically see the result, and that's kind of it. We get a few other scenes that are completely arbitrary to the story and instead just serve to show us how obnoxious, egotistical, delusional, and stupid Rufus is. They primarily take place in a wasteland setting wherein Rufus and Candy are either riding his two-person motorcycle or dealing with the consequences of it breaking down. In his vanilla SF4 ending, he drives past Ken and Ryu in the desert, who are on foot, and calls them losers for no reason. Sometime later, we see Rufus pushing his now broken down bike through the same desert when Ken and Ryu drive up in a truck, offering to give him a tow. He refuses sheerly out of pride, and they drive off as Rufus shakes his fist and screams at them under the high noon sun. The character's story is wholly ineffectual to Street Fighter 4's narrative. He doesn't appear a single time in the ties that bind Street Fighter 4 anime film, and only interacts with a few roster members in rather meaningless ways during arcade ladders. Every time we see Rufus, it's only to highlight some part of his extremely off-putting personality, but he never moves the plot forward, undergoes any kind of character evolution, or even hints at the idea that he might go through some kind of arc eventually. The entire Street Fighter universe is more or less apathetic to the bumbling joke of a character, and thus, so are we as players. Executive producer Yoshinori Ono noted in an interview that he and his team made Rufus intentionally silly, likening him to a, quote, American Dan. Now, for those who don't know, Dan Hibiki is Street Fighter's resident joke character and was designed to playfully parody Art of Fighting characters after SNK clearly borrowed a lot of their designs from Street Fighter 2. Now, like Rufus, Dan is overly proud, egotistical, and delusional about his own skills. He sometimes fails to tie his belt properly and performs noticeably weaker and less effective versions of some of the franchise's iconic attacks. But despite all this, Dan has become a household name with a seat at the Street Fighter table, as players are happy, or at least not overly annoyed, to have him join any given roster. The reason for this discrepancy between joke characters is the fact that, unlike Rufus, Dan has a fleshed out backstory as the son of a revered fighter who was murdered by Sagat. Dan devotes himself to becoming strong enough to avenge his father, and though he has yet to get there, his noble cause does afford him some palpable charisma. We also see Dan constantly make silly mistakes, such as forgetting to put his phone number on the dojo marketing posters he's putting up, but other characters like Sakura and Blanca still befriend him and help him out, showing that he does have some positive qualities that might perhaps grow as he matures. With virtually no foundational story for his personality to root and grow from, Rufus simply becomes the sum of a hodgepodge of surface-level ideas which don't add up to much. As such, Rufus is more of a joke on the audience as we're constantly trolled by cringe comments and dumb decisions. At the end of his Ultra SF4 story, which is a lot longer than most others, Capcom has us watch him and Candy inconsequentially discuss the prospect of, get this, driving to the North Pole to escape the heat of the desert. Said conversation goes on for some 40 seconds with nearly the same static visual before we realize we're the butt of the joke for giving our time up for nothing. While Rufus's story and personality may have very clearly been jokes, his gameplay was anything but. Though he was never really regarded as a contender for being the best in the game, Rufus had some incredible tools that could make playing against him just as annoying as listening to him rant. Despite his size and his shape, Rufus retained the speed and agility of developers' original intentions for him, and he had a dive kick with no initial height restriction. Now, dive kicks are famous for being easily overpowered and abusable in 2D fighting games, and Rufus's was so infamous that a direct parody of him appeared in 2013's Dive Kick, a satirical title that was meant to poke fun at the ridiculous nature of the move that was so prominent in the games of the era. Rufus players could spam his dive kick on repeat, gunning for their opponent's ankles and converting into big damage combos upon any and every successful hit. He also had a special called the Messiah Kick, an invincible reversal that would seemingly beat out any maneuver it clashed with, meaning users could and often would just toss it out haphazardly. What's more, Messiah Kick had gimmicky follow-ups that players could use to cheese out sneaky damage with. Now, on top of all of this, Rufus had seemingly endless ways of converting successful hits into his Space Opera Symphony Ultra 1, adding even more damage and frustration to the equation. He was a somewhat prominent character in the competitive realm as players like Ricky Ortiz and Justin Wong used him to compete in and win many high-profile tournaments. While it wasn't all that fun to fight against Rufus, watching others' pain was a whole different story as audiences grew to raise the Rufus whenever players like Ricky or Justin landed Space Opera Symphony in tournament. This is where the entire crowd would imitate the final part of the Ultra animation and offer up a collective as it played out. And that entertainment value at the competitive level was probably the best thing the character had going for him, but certainly wasn't enough to even begin to balance the scales. Rufus did make an appearance in the ill-fated Street Fighter Cross Tekken, where he was juxtaposed with his much more appreciated Tekken counterpart, Bob, but it's highly unlikely he'll be returning for another main roster run in the Street Fighter franchise anytime soon. Capcom did explore their original idea of the Break Kung Fu fighter through Street Fighter VI's Jamie, who's likely a kind of spiritual successor to King Cobra, but that might imply that we won't ever see King Cobra either. It's not simply that Rufus was overweight or that he had an oppressive set of moves or even that he said off-putting things constantly. It was all of this together on top of an absolutely empty foundation that caused a perfect storm of hate to form for the character. But what do you think? Does the extra jiggly dive and Messiah kicking Roof Razor get a worse rap than he deserves? Or do you hope we never see this character ever again? We look forward to reading your thoughts in the comments below, and if you're interested, we recently took a closer look at Juri, another Street Fighter IV character who checked all of the boxes with flying colors and thus became one of the franchise's most successful icons to date. So if you'd like to see how Capcom did things right, check out that video next. I've been John Velociraptor Guerrero for EventHubs. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in our next video.